The last legitimately elected Republican president of the United States was Dwight Eisenhower. And I just, I lay it out. Let's start at the beginning. Richard Nixon in 1968, when he was running for president against Hubert Humphrey, then the vice president to Lyndon Johnson. Richard Nixon got wind of the fact that LBJ and Hubert Humphrey had, in fact, successfully negotiated peace in Vietnam in August of 1968. So what did he do? He called up the president of South Vietnam, or he had his Anna Chennault, one of his agents, call him up and say, hey, if you'll refuse to go to the Paris peace talks and sign that deal that you just worked out, then I'll make you rich. And the president of, I think it was Diem, the president of South Vietnam said, okay, cool, let's do that. And so as a result, the war did not end, and Humphrey got defeated. Had the war ended, of course, Humphrey would have become president in a heartbeat. And the war did not end, and Nixon dragged it out for another 4 years, actually another 6 years, I think, and until 74, when Jerry Ford became president, when he resigned. And the result of that was an additional 2 million dead Vietnamese and an additional 24,000 dead American soldiers. So that was Nixon's treason against the United States. Nixon was followed by Ronald Reagan. The New York Times did a piece on this last year when they discovered that Ben Barnes, the former Republican lieutenant governor of Texas, had been on the plane and in the meeting when Trump's campaign manager flew over to Paris and met with representatives of Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran at the time, and cut a deal with them to hang on to the U.S. hostages in just a blatant act of treason against the United States in order to screw Jimmy Carter. And in fact, the president of Iran at the time was a fellow by the name of Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, and Bani Sadr emigrated to the United States in the mid-1980s and went to the Christian Science Monitor and just said right up front, I came to the United States to expose the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Ayatollah Khomeini. I had negotiated the release of the hostages in the middle of 1980, and the Ayatollah put a kibosh on it because he had cut a deal with Reagan to get spare parts for the American weaponry that the Shah had bought. And in fact, they were already shipping spare tires via Israel into Iran in the middle of 1980 as part of Reagan's deal with the Ayatollah to screw Jimmy Carter. So there's your second treason committed by a Republican candidate for president that helped make him president. Then you've got Jerry Ford. Jerry Ford was never elected to anything other than Congress when it came out that Spiro Agnew, just like Richard Nixon, had been taking bribes for years. Nixon didn't get busted for the bribes. We learned about that later. But Spiro Agnew did get busted by the Justice Department for those bribes, or perhaps it was by the Attorney General of New Jersey, I believe he was from. But in any case, Spiro Agnew had to resign. The deal they cut was, we will not prosecute you, we will not throw you in prison if you simply step down from the vice presidency, and Agnew did so. And so Nixon put Ford in his place. And Ford then ended the Vietnam War, but Ford never would have become president if Nixon hadn't committed treason. So, there we go with a bunch of illegitimate Republican presidents. That's kind of back to Nixon. Now back to Reagan. Reagan was succeeded by George Herbert Walker Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush had been his vice president. Again, he wouldn't have been president if he hadn't been Reagan's vice president, but perhaps more tellingly, on the last week of his presidency, or the last 5 weeks of his presidency, Christmas Eve in 1992, Bill Clinton had just been elected president in November, and Lawrence Walsh was the special prosecutor who had been appointed by Congress to look into Iran-Contra, which, of course, was the deal where Reagan gave weapons to Iran in exchange for their holding the hostages. And then Iran gave Reagan money, which Reagan then, under the table money, which Reagan then used to buy weapons that he shipped down to the Contras in Central America, which created the current mess in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, et cetera, that is, today causing the refugee problem that we've had for the last 10 years or so. So anyhow, George W. Bush was like, what do I do? What do I do? And his attorney general at the time was this very corrupt lawyer by the name of Bill Barr. And Bill Barr said, hey, just pardon them all. Once you pardon them, they can't be forced to testify. And because there were 5 or 6 of these guys, the DOJ had already convicted Caspar Weinberger. They had convicted Ollie North. They had convicted 5, maybe 6 people in association with this treasonous crime to basically pay the Ayatollah to hang on to the U.S. hostages so Reagan could win the '80 election. So on Christmas Eve of 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush pardoned all those people, and the screaming headline in the New York Times, prosecutor calls cover-up. And it was a cover-up. It was a cover-up of Iran-Contra. So that's another illegitimate Republican president. The next one was George W. Bush. He only won because of Florida. He lost the general election by 500,000 votes. And had he lost Florida, he would have lost the Electoral College as well. Well, his brother rigged that one by purging 57,000 black people off the voting rolls in Florida about 2 months before the election. These people showed up to vote, but they weren't allowed to vote because they were no longer on the rolls. And Bush won by 537 votes, as I recall, something like that. So, another illegitimate president. And then, of course, when it became contentious, 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court said, hey, we're going to make him president anyway, even though it looks like he lost the election. And then, of course, George W. Bush won re-election in 2004 because, as he had told Mickey Herskowitz back in 1999, he was going to have a war with Iraq that would make him a wartime president, which is the best way to get reelected. It worked for FDR, worked for Nixon, worked for LBJ. I mean, hey, let's do this, right? And so, he lied the American people into 2 unnecessary and illegal wars. So Bush was double illegitimate. And then, of course, you got Trump in 2016. Greg Palast ran the numbers. Over 4 million people in swing states were denied the ability to vote, or their votes were not counted. Their votes were struck off by voter challenges, by signature match challenges, by just a whole raft of strategies and programs designed to suppress the vote. And of course, also, there was the voter suppression of Donald Trump himself vis-a-vis Stormy Daniels. After the Access Hollywood tape came out, if America had known that he had been sleeping with a porn star right after his wife gave birth to Barron, there's no way they would have elected him president. I mean, he was running against a woman, Hillary Clinton. But he paid off Stormy Daniels $130,000, and so we didn't learn about it until long after the election, until Trump was president. And of course, he got nailed for that, but the damage was already done. He had become president in 2016, not to mention all the help he got from Russia that was documented by Robert Mueller, including 10 instances of criminal obstruction of justice by Donald Trump himself into the investigation of Russia's help to make him president. So, bottom line, America, number one, should be sick and tired of Republicans breaking the law and committing treason to become president of the United States. It's been going on since 1968, over and over and over again. And number two, the Democrats need to start talking about this. Can you imagine if Democratic presidential candidates had done this kind of stuff? Republicans would be screaming about it. Everybody in America would be able to recite every one of the things I just told you. Come on, Democrats, get with the program.